Life after the divorce was quiet and measured, but nothing like I had imagined in my youth. When I was younger, I thought that by the time I reached 40, I would have everything. A stable family, a house, and perhaps even a fulfilled dream. But reality turned out to be completely different. A divorce, my ex-husband leaving for his young assistant, and the constant struggle for a normal existence left me with my son and a small flower shop on the coast. Floristry was my salvation. I could spend hours fussing with flowers, picking out shades and textures, creating perfect bouquets for weddings and celebrations. Work distracted me from thoughts of how drastically my life had changed. In the shop, I found solace. Among the bright colors and delicate aromas of flowers, Carl, my son, was my only close person. At 23, he was on the verge of an independent life, studying friends, plans for the future. I tried to be a good mother and support him in everything, although sometimes I felt like he no longer needed me, that he could handle things on his own. Sometimes, when Carl brought friends home, I would sit in the shop for a long time to avoid interfering with their conversations and laughter. I wanted Carl to live a full life without burdening himself with worries about me. Among his friends was always Adrian, a tall, athletic, and always smiling guy who had been friends with Carl since childhood. Adrian was 2 years older than Carl and always seemed calm and confident to me. He often stopped by for lunch or just to chat, and I always saw in him the same boy who used to play with Carl in our garden. But something began to change. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when, but Adrian's glances became different, more attentive, more intense. I thought it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things. But one evening, when Carl was late at school, Adrian unexpectedly came into my shop. We started talking as usual, but at some point, he grew more serious. I was telling him about a new project, a floral arrangement for a big wedding, and suddenly realized that he was listening too closely, as if trying to understand something beyond my words. "You are amazing," he suddenly said, interrupting me. I stopped and looked at him, trying to grasp what he meant. "I've always admired your work. You put so much soul into it." His words sounded sincere, and I felt warm from the compliment. We continued talking, and as often happens during quiet evenings, the lights outside went out. We were left in semi-darkness, illuminated only by the dim streetlights filtering through the window. I joked about being prepared for anything, even unexpected power outages. But the joke felt forced because I sensed something more, something elusive in that silence. Adrian moved closer to me. His eyes sparkled in the faint light, and for a moment I got lost in his gaze. He leaned in slowly and gently kissed the corner of my lips, softly, hesitantly, as if unsure of my reaction. I flinched, but didn't pull away immediately, as if frozen in that moment, not knowing what to say or how to react. It was like a flash, quick, unexpected, and almost painful. I stepped back, trying to regain control, but the moment had already left its mark. We stood in silence, both unsure of how to continue the conversation. "I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me," he said, stepping back. I nodded, unable to find the words to express my conflicting feelings. When he left, I was alone in the dark shop. It was a brief moment, but it stirred something inside me that I had long tried to bury. Too many years had passed since I allowed myself to feel like this. Too much time spent living within boundaries, afraid to step beyond them. And now I stood, overwhelmed by a strange mix of shame, excitement, and uncertainty, realizing that this evening had changed something significant in my life. After that evening, I tried to convince myself that it was all a misunderstanding, a foolish accident that would never happen again. But Adrian's words and that brief kiss kept haunting me. I lived according to my usual routine. Mornings at the shop, followed by lunches with Carl, who would come home from school or training. I tried to be a role model of resilience and calmness for him, even if a storm of emotions was raging inside me that I couldn't explain. Despite my attempts to return to normal life, I found myself looking at my phone differently, waiting for messages or calls from Adrian. But he didn't write. A few days passed, and it seemed like he was avoiding me, that he didn't need me at all. I convinced myself that this was how it should be, that it was right. He was my son's friend, and I couldn't afford to blur that line for even a second. One evening, when Carl left for a few days to a nearby city for a sports competition, I decided to stay late at the shop, working on new orders. I was making bouquets in the silence that enveloped me, helping me forget all my worries. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the shop door. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially at such an hour. Adrian was standing on the doorstep. He looked a bit lost, as if he didn't know why he had come. In his hands, he held a pack of coffee and croissants, clearly picked up along the way. "I thought you might be here alone," he said with a smile that hid his inner tension. "I thought maybe I could keep you company." I invited him inside, trying to mask my surprise and slight nervousness. We sat at a small table, and he started talking about his plans, how difficult it was to juggle work and studies. As I listened to him, I suddenly realized that behind his mask of confidence and smiles was a person who was also searching for answers to his questions. I noticed how his eyes occasionally lingered on me, as if he was waiting for something, but didn't dare to voice his thoughts. We talked, laughed, and shared stories from past years, as if trying to make up for lost time. It felt like I was talking to the same boy who used to play in our garden. But at the same time, I saw a grown man whose looks and words stirred my hidden emotions. At one point, Adrian casually touched my hand. It was a light, almost invisible touch, but it made my heart beat faster. "You know, you're amazing," he said softly, looking at my hands nervously folding ribbons for the bouquets. "I've always felt comfortable around you." I didn't know what to say. We were sitting across from each other, and I could feel the air between us charged with electricity, each moment stretching into eternity. Adrian leaned closer and kissed me again, but this kiss was entirely different. Long, deep, and filled with everything we were both afraid to acknowledge. I felt his hands gently wrap around me as he guided me in this moment, which I was terrified to shatter. I couldn't stop, but I couldn't let myself continue either. We pulled back, and I saw in his eyes not only attraction, but also vulnerability, the kind that often hides behind masks. "Megan, I can't explain what's happening to me," he said, and his voice carried the anxiety that echoed in my heart. I know this is wrong, but I cut him off, placing my finger on his lips, not letting him say more. That kiss held everything, doubts, passion, and the fear we both were too scared to admit. I tried to justify to myself that it was just a weakness, a moment that could be forgotten, but I knew that for both of us, it meant far more than we were willing to admit. Adrian left late, leaving me in complete silence in the shop. I sat in the darkness, feeling his taste on my lips, and the chilling realization that there was no way back. Everything that had once seemed so right and stable suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. I didn't know what would happen next, but I understood one thing. That kiss was not just a mistake. It was a point of no return, a crossing of a boundary I had promised myself I would never cross. After that night in the shop, my thoughts kept returning to Adrian. It felt like I had lost control of my life, as if I was caught in a whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't explain or suppress. I tried to distract myself with work, but my hands would mechanically sort through flowers. And every time I was alone, his image would appear before me, warm, persistent, too close. I couldn't and didn't want to share this with Carl. He was too absorbed in his own affairs, studies, and plans, and I didn't want to disrupt his world with my problems. I tried to be the same, as always, a caring mother, a friend, someone who was always there when needed. But inside, everything was changing, and the further it went, the harder it was to hide. Every time Adrian appeared at the shop's doorstep, I felt my heart stop, and the air between us filled with tension I couldn't ignore. One evening, when Carl went out to meet friends, Adrian came to the shop again. We were sitting on the floor, surrounded by flowers, sorting through leaves and stems, and our conversations flowed freely and effortlessly. He was telling me about his plans for the future, about how difficult it was for him to find his place in life. I listened, and suddenly realized that these conversations had become something more to me than just passing the time. I saw in him someone with whom I could be honest, with whom I didn't need to pretend to be strong and flawless. At some point he fell silent, looking at me intently. His eyes were full of unspoken worry, and I sensed he wanted to say something important, but hesitated. "Megan," he began, nervously fidgeting with stems in his hands. "You do understand that this isn't just nothing right. I can't stop thinking about you. I try, really, but..." He trailed off, and I looked at him, unable to respond. His words stirred all the fears and hopes I had been desperately trying to suppress. I knew the situation was out of control, but it was too late to stop. We sat in the dim light, the tension between us palpable and inescapable. I reached out to him without thinking, simply following my heart. Our lips met again, and this kiss was nothing like the ones before. It was full of desperation, passion, and inexplicable tenderness. Adrian pulled me close, as if afraid this moment would slip away and never return. It was the kiss of two people who had long been lost in their feelings, but couldn't find a way back. I could feel him trembling, his fingers gently brushing my shoulders as if testing how far he could go. I knew this kiss wasn't just a display of passion. It was an attempt to hold on to something important, something slipping through our fingers. He kissed me in a way no one had kissed me for years, without words, but with such deep understanding that I couldn't remain indifferent. "I'm sorry," he whispered when we pulled away. I shouldn't have, but I can't help it. I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding, and my mind was swirling with thoughts of Carl, our friendship, and the fact that we were doing something unacceptable. But at that moment, I felt only one thing. I was alive, and the feeling was too sharp to ignore. We both knew it was wrong, but neither of us wanted to back away. The kiss was a boundary we had crossed, and with each time that line was pushed further and further. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads, as if I was on the edge of a cliff, both terrified and eager to take a step forward. Adrian was the one pulling me out of my familiar world, and it scared me as much as it attracted me. When he left, I remained sitting on the floor, surrounded by flowers that suddenly seemed lifeless and dull. I knew I couldn't turn back, that our feelings had engulfed us both too strongly, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't know how to handle it. I tried to keep myself together, but each new day felt like a challenge. Adrian was no longer just my son's friend. He had become the one who filled the emptiness I had ignored for so long. But with every shared glance, every word, and every gesture, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong move could destroy everything I had built over the years. Carl didn't know anything, but it seemed like he sensed that something had changed. He came home tired and irritated. His usual kindness and carefree attitude had vanished. I tried to be attentive, asked about his studies, his friends, but he responded curtly, reluctantly, as if something inside him had broken. He started to notice that I was secretive and anxious, but he said nothing, and I was afraid to admit even to myself that I might be the cause of his coldness. One evening, Carl unexpectedly came home earlier than I had expected. I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book when he walked in, tossed his bag into the corner, and sat across from me, not taking his eyes off me. There was something strange in his gaze, a mix of hurt and discontent that I had never seen before. "Mom," he began, unexpectedly serious. "You've been acting weird lately. You avoid conversations, and when you talk, it's like you're not really here. What's going on?" I froze, not knowing what to say. My thoughts were racing, searching for excuses, but everything I could think of felt shallow and insincere. "Everything's fine, Carl. I just have a lot of work," and I trailed off, realizing that my words sounded strained. He looked at me as if he could see right through me, and I felt uneasy. "Is this because of Adrian?" he suddenly asked, and my heart skipped a beat. I couldn't believe he spoke about it so directly. "I saw how you two were talking. You've become too close, it seems." My head spun, and panic began to rise within me. Everything I had feared so much had suddenly become a reality. Carl was smart and observant, and I couldn't deceive him, no matter how hard I tried. "Carl, it's not what you think." I tried to explain, but he cut me off. "Then what is it?" His voice hardened, tinged with notes of hurt and disappointment. "Mom, Adrian is my friend. I trusted both of you. You were always an example to me, and now I feel like I'm losing you." I was overwhelmed by conflicting emotions: shame, anger at myself, fear of losing my son. I couldn't find the words to explain to him why it happened, why I had allowed myself to go this far. I understood that every answer would only make things worse. "Carl, I'm just as confused," I tried to say, but his face grew darker and he stood up, not letting me finish. "You know, I thought you were stronger," he said quietly, but his words cut deep into my heart. "I don't know how to look at you now." He turned and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a growing sense of guilt. I sat there, unable to move, feeling as though an insurmountable wall had grown between me and my son. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how our life was falling apart before my eyes, and I didn't know how to fix it. Everything that once seemed so important and real had now become the source of pain and disappointment. And for the first time, I felt that I was solely responsible for this chaos. Part 5, The Last Kiss and the Unveiling. In the days that followed, the house felt empty and cold, even when Carl was around. We barely spoke, avoided meeting each other's eyes, as if afraid that any word or gesture would expose the truth I was trying to hide behind a mask of calmness. Adrian stopped coming by, and I knew he could feel the tension too. Suddenly, I found myself in complete isolation, as if everything that made up my life had collapsed, leaving me alone with my mistakes. One evening, when Carl went out with his friends, I heard a knock on the door. Opening it, I saw Adrian. He stood there, drenched from an unexpected rain, with a tired expression on his face. His eyes were filled with despair mixed with hope, and seeing this both moved and frightened me. I couldn't ignore him, but I didn't know what to do. "I can't keep going like this, Megan," he said quietly, as if afraid to shatter the fragile silence between us. "I can't live in this state, not knowing what will happen next." We stood at the doorstep, and I felt each moment stretch into eternity. I wanted to tell him that it was over, that we needed to part ways and forget each other, but the words got stuck in my throat. Adrian stepped forward, and I didn't pull away, no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I should. "Adrian, everything is too complicated," I said, struggling to find the right words. "We've gone too far." He didn't respond. Instead, he suddenly hugged me tightly, as if it was the last time, as if trying to hold on to something that had long been lost. His hands were warm, and I felt everything inside me tighten with pain and contradictions. I knew this was a moment of farewell, a moment when we had to let go of everything that had bound us, but it was unbearable to do so. Our lips met once more, and this kiss was filled not only with passion, but also with forgiveness, bitterness, and the realization that we couldn't be together. He kissed me with such desperate tenderness that I felt tears welling up in my eyes. This kiss held everything, our tangled past, mistakes, and the fear we had both been hiding. And at that very moment, the door opened. Carl stood at the threshold, seeing us in this most vulnerable moment. I pulled away, but it was already too late. His gaze full of pain and confusion pierced me. He didn't say anything, just looked at us, trying to comprehend what he had just seen. In his eyes, I saw it all. Disappointment, anger, betrayal. I knew something was wrong. Carl said quietly, but his voice shook. But I never thought I'd see it with my own eyes. I tried to approach him, to explain that it was a mistake, that it was more complicated than he thought. But Carl stepped back as if each of my steps caused him pain. "Carl, please listen." I didn't know what else to say. My words sounded empty and meaningless. "You're my mother, and I always believed that you understood how important what we have is to me," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "And you, Adrian, you were supposed to be my friend, not destroy my family." He turned and left, slamming the door loudly, leaving Adrian and me in complete silence. We both knew this was the end. We had destroyed everything that was dear to us. Adrian left without a word, and I was left alone in a house filled with memories and pain. That last kiss was not just a moment of saying goodbye to Adrian, but also to a part of myself, the part that had hoped for something more than just mundane routine. I understood that I had lost my son, his trust, and all my principles for a moment of weakness. And now the only thing I had left was the realization that there was no way back.